Amazon's Wonder Girl. How Julianne Koepke survived 11 days alone in the Amazon. It was 12:36 p.m., and the moment lightning struck the plane's right wing, the fuel tank caught fire. Julianne Koepke's mother turned to her and spoke for the last time. "It's all over now." At that moment, the life of Julianne, who was only 17 years old, was split in two. Before the sky, and after. Born in Lima in 1954, Julianne had a childhood immersed in nature, filled with animals. Her first friend was a parrot named Tobias, who had come home before she was born. She was closer to her mother, but the three members of her family were united in their love of nature. Yet, when her scientist parents became absorbed in their research, Julianne sometimes felt lonely. When she was 14, she moved with her family deep into the Amazon rainforest. They named the research station they built on stilts after a local bird, Panguana. Now, her education continued not in school classrooms, but in the heart of nature. There was no electricity, no running water. The connection to the outside world was severed. But her parents taught her how to survive in the jungle. She must always shake her boots before putting them on, because there could be a spider inside. If she got lost, she should find a stream and follow its flow, because water always leads somewhere. She studied mathematics on morning walks with her father. She learned to identify plants, insects, and birds. The Amazon became her school, and she soon came to love the forest as much as her family. Despite all her jungle training, she had to return to Lima to take her exams to graduate from high school. She returned in March 1970, completed her classes, passed her exams, and planned to return to Panguana a few days before New Year's Eve, 1971. However, there was a graduation ceremony on December 22nd and 23rd, followed by a school ball. Her mother, who had come to Lima to pick her up, saw how important these ceremonies were to Julianne and postponed their return by a few days. Julianne attended both the ceremony and the ball in her magnificent blue dress. The next day, on New Year's Eve, mother and daughter prepared for their return. All flights were full. Only the notorious LANSA Airlines had seats left. A year earlier, 99 out of 100 passengers had died on a plane from the same company. Her father had said, "Please try another airline," but her mother was convinced. "I don't think it will be a problem," and bought 2 tickets on LANSA. The Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop operating LANSA Flight 508 left Lima just before noon for Pucallpa and reached an altitude of about 21,000 feet. Soon after, it began to grow dark. The plane entered turbulence and within minutes was pulled into the heart of a storm. A terrible shaking occurred. Christmas presents, flowers, and drinks flew through the air. Passengers screamed. The overhead luggage compartments burst open, scattering their contents throughout the cabin. Julianne would later describe that moment. The clouds became darker and darker, and the flight became much more turbulent. We were in the middle of pitch-black clouds and a storm, with thunder and lightning. It was completely dark around us, and lightning was constantly striking. Then I saw a bright light on the right wing. It was 12:36 p.m. when the lightning pierced the right wing and ignited the fuel tank. Julianne's mother turned to her and spoke her last words. "It's all over now." The right wing tearing off from the fuselage was inevitable. This compromised the plane's structural integrity, causing it to go into a steep dive and break apart. Julianne recounts, "I heard an incredible noise of engines and human screams. Then the plane started to fall steeply. Compared to the previous noise, there was an incredible silence at that moment. I could only hear the sound of the wind. I was still strapped to my seat. My mother and the man sitting in the aisle had been thrown from their seats. I am absolutely sure I was in free fall, spinning in circles. I saw the forest below me, which looked like green cauliflower and broccoli. Then I lost consciousness." Still strapped to her seat, Julianne had fallen from a height of about 3 kilometers. Exactly how she survived is unknown, but many believe the row of seats she was in played a key role. It likely spun like a helicopter propeller during the fall, slowing her descent speed, while the trees and multi-layered vegetation cushioned the impact. Julianne says, "I was definitely strapped to the seat when I fell. The seats must have acted as a buffer. Otherwise, I couldn't have survived." And now, in the middle of the Amazon, she was completely alone and seriously injured. For the next 19 hours, she drifted in and out of consciousness. She finally came to the next morning and managed to stay conscious. According to her, what brought her to her senses was the intense and heavy rainfall. When the crash happened, she was wearing a sleeveless mini dress. She had lost her glasses and one of her sandals. She had a broken collarbone, torn cruciate ligaments, a partially broken shin bone, a sprained cervical spine, deep cuts on her arms and legs, and one eye swollen shut. All this physical damage was a miracle in itself, considering the 3-kilometer fall. Although her mother's seat was empty, it was next to her, dislodged and overturned. Despite her poor condition, her first concern was to find her mother. Crawling and dragging herself, she began to search the area around the crash site, frequently calling out, "Mother!" She stayed near her seat in small circles, kept her location in mind, and despite her failing vision, managed to orient herself by marking some trees. She spent most of the day searching for her mother but found no trace of her. However, on the ground, she found a bag full of candies, which would become her only source of food in the struggle for survival that lay ahead. At one point, she heard the sound of aircraft circling above. But the jungle vegetation was so dense and high that it was impossible for them to see her. She realized that if she wanted to be spotted, she needed to reach a clearer area. After the sound of the aircraft faded away, she noticed the presence of another sound, the gurgle of flowing water. Soon, she found a small water source flowing into a little stream. This was crucial for 2 reasons. She now had fresh water, and thanks to her training in Panguana, she knew this small water source would connect to a larger river system that could eventually lead her to civilization. Julianne's journey towards civilization had begun. She started moving along the bank of the small stream. She relied on her knowledge of the forest. She knew how to protect herself from snakes and other poisonous creatures. As she walked, she had tied her remaining sandal with a string, throwing it forward and pulling it back to test the ground, checking if the path was safe. At first, progressing this way was very difficult because she had to watch out not only for snakes but also for the giant logs she frequently encountered. So she often had to climb over them or crawl under them. Over time, the small stream began to widen and reached a considerable size. The banks of such waterways often dried up in places, which allowed Julianne to walk more comfortably. Around 6 p.m., as it began to get dark, she found a sheltered spot to spend the night and collapsed on the riverbed. When she started walking again the next morning, she heard the familiar call of the king vulture. She remembered this sound from Panguana. She knew that vultures only circled near the dead, so she thought there might be corpses nearby. The next day, in front of her, was an overturned row of seats with 3 passengers still strapped in with their seatbelts. Julianne describes that moment. "I didn't see much. Just people's feet pointing upwards. I poked their feet with a stick. I couldn't touch the corpses. I didn't smell anything. They hadn't been eaten yet, and the bodies weren't excessively decomposed. I mean, decay must have started, but I couldn't notice it. I could tell one was a woman because her toenails were painted. Looking at the others' trousers and shoes, I thought they were men. After a while, I moved on, but when I first found them, I was as if in shock." After this shocking encounter, on December 28th, Julianne's wristwatch stopped. This was the 4th day of her grueling journey. By then, the small stream had turned into a larger stream, and now it had become a small river. Since it was the rainy season, she found no fruit to collect along the way, and she had eaten her last piece of candy. She had no knife to cut palm roots or catch fish, and she didn't dare eat anything else. The river provided her with water, but hunger was becoming an increasingly serious problem. Ironically, as she continued her walk, she herself became a food source for forest insects. Bugs, mosquitoes, flesh flies laying eggs under her skin, and even wild bees that clung to her hair, though they had no sting. On the 5th or 6th day of her trek, what saved Julianne from the despair she was about to succumb to was the sound of a hoatzin, a reptilian bird. She recognized this sound from Panguana and knew these birds nested near large bodies of water. This meant a new glimmer of hope that there might be something related to civilization in her surroundings. Hearing the birds call, a new energy was born within her, and she continued her journey. She finally reached the bank of a wide river. but there was no sign of people anywhere. She heard the sound of planes in the distance, but after a while, the sounds stopped. The pilots had left the area without finding her. Julianne was very angry about this. Seeing the empty landscape around her and realizing how far from civilization she still was, she felt despair. This anger quickly turned to sadness, but she pulled herself together quickly. She thought that where there was a river, there must also be people, and she continued on. The river presented new problems for Julianne. Thick reeds stretched along the waterway. Julianne started walking in the shallow waters at the edge of the river. But she knew that stingrays nested in these waters and took every step carefully. However, she was progressing incredibly slowly, yet she felt she needed to go faster. Finally, despite the piranhas, she decided to swim towards the middle of the river. She knew stingrays didn't come into deep waters, and piranhas were only dangerous in stagnant water. As the sun set, she swam back to the shore to find a place to spend the night. However, due to her painful wounds becoming infected, it was impossible for her to sleep at night. Thus a cycle began. Julianne would swim in the middle of the river, moving with the current, and after covering a long distance, would return to the shore to spend the night. A few days later, one morning she felt a sharp pain in her upper back. When she put her hand on her back, it was covered in blood. She had been burned by the sun while swimming in the river for days. She would later learn these were second-degree burns. As she continued to follow the current, she began to hallucinate. While moving along the shore, she thought she saw the roof of a house or heard chickens clucking. Her mind was filled with dreams of food. Every morning, it became increasingly difficult to persuade herself to get back into the water. It was the 10th day of this incredible ordeal in the jungle. As she moved along the river, she constantly encountered large logs and had to climb over each one with her already exhausted body. With each new obstacle, she was careful not to injure herself further or break a bone. At the end of an exhausting day, she swam to the shore and found a spot covered with soft sand and fell asleep there for a few minutes. When she opened her eyes, there was a boat in front of her. Julianne couldn't believe her eyes. She crawled forward to reach the boat and touch it. It was not a mirage. Then, she noticed a small, worn path leading from the riverbank. Maggots had infested the wounds on Julianne's arm. She tried to squeeze some out but wasn't successful. She remembered earlier in Panguana, her father had used diesel fuel to remove maggots from a dog's wound. According to some sources, she took this fuel from the boat's motor, according to others, from a hut along the path. Wherever she got it, she poured the fuel over her wounds, and the maggots started to come to the surface. She removed exactly 35 maggots. Then she followed the path. This short distance took an hour for the exhausted Julianne. When she reached the hut, she hoped to find someone inside, but there was no one. She spent the rest of the night there and managed to get some sleep. When she woke up in the morning, she was still alone. This was her 11th day in the jungle. It started to rain. She draped a piece of tarpaulin she found in the hut over her shoulders. In the afternoon, the rain stopped. She thought about walking, but couldn't stand up due to the pain in her feet and decided to rest for one more day. In the late afternoon, she heard some sounds. At first, she thought they were hallucinations, but the sounds were getting closer. 3 lumberjacks emerged from the forest and were greatly surprised to see this young girl in the hut. Julianne told them in Spanish, "I am a survivor from the Lanza crash," and told them her name. That night, the 3 men cleaned Julianne's wounds and gave her food. The next morning, they put her in a canoe and took her on a 7-hour journey to a lumber station in Pucallpa. There, a local pilot agreed to take her to the hospital. After a short 15-minute flight, Julianne was reunited with her father. While in the hospital bed, she provided information to investigators to help locate the wreckage and find more bodies. On January 12th, the body of her mother, Maria Coepc, was found. In March 1972, Julianne recovered her health and returned to her school in Lima. She studied for 2 more years and took the entrance exam for a German university. However, she was constantly followed by journalists and people curious about her story. This situation deeply disturbed her father. He even had panic attacks and wanted to send Julianne to Germany, to her grandmother and aunt. Julianne was not warm to this idea. She didn't want to go to Germany. This caused a rift between her and her father. Julianne describes that period. I was very angry. Panguana and my school were the only things I had left. It took me 2 years to accept this situation. Fortunately, I had a very nice school in Kiel, in northern Germany, and I made very good friends. But it was very difficult to get along with my father. Her father also returned to Germany a few years later, and eventually, the ice between them melted. Following in her mother and father's footsteps, Julianne studied biology at the University of Kiel and graduated in 1980. Then she began her doctoral studies at Ludwig Maximilian University. She returned to Peru, to Panguana, to prepare her doctoral thesis on bats. Her father had suggested this area to her because he knew there was a bat population there. Julianne spent 18 months there and identified a total of 52 bat species. Years later, in 1998, the famous film director Werner Herzog contacted her. He wanted to make a documentary with Julianne, who was now married and working at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology in Munich. Herzog had a personal connection to this story. In 1971, he was in Peru during the crash, scouting the area for preparations for his film Aguirre, The Wrath of God. In fact, he had also reserved a seat on LANSA Flight 508 for New Year's Eve, but due to a last-minute change in his travel plans, he had cancelled his reservation. As part of the documentary, he offered to take Julianne back to the site of the crash. Julianne accepted this offer and said of that time, "Werner Herzog helped me rethink my past. The questions he asked by putting himself in my place, his ability to listen to me completely, and the chance to return to the area where I lived those fear-filled days was the best therapy for me." This visit resulted in an hour-long documentary titled Wings of Hope, which was released in 2000. Influenced by Herzog, Julianne decided to preserve the Panguana research area left by her family. She expanded the land from 186 hectares to 700 hectares. In 2011, working with the Peruvian government, she contributed to the area being declared a natural heritage site. Thus, she both kept her family's legacy alive and managed to permanently protect the region from logging, hunting, and human settlement. After the documentary, Julianne decided to write about her experiences in a book. While researching for the book, back in Germany, she came across a letter her father had sent to Julianne's aunt at Christmas in 1972. In the letter, her father had written that Julianne absolutely must not return to Panguana. Despite this, his opinion had softened a few years later. After reading this letter, Julianne cried and felt freed from a dark ache that had suffocated her for a long time. "I had always suspected that my survival, not my mother's, was a problem for my father. But then I understood that he was practically paralyzed with grief. That Christmas was the first anniversary of my mother's death. He was completely alone in Panguana, face to face with his fate, and the last thing he wanted to see at that moment was me, because I looked so much like my mother. It was unbearable for my father." Her father died in 2000 at the age of 87. But Julianne believes her father had emotionally died the moment he lost his wife. His life was over. He lived like a machine. After he died, I found a small candle. It said, Panguana Candle, on it. Every year on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of my mother's death, he would place this candle by his bedside and light it. From her father's letters, Julianne uncovered another devastating piece of information. It appeared her mother had been alive after falling from the plane. "My father thought my mother survived for 2 weeks. Maybe until January 6th. Because when he went to identify her body, it wasn't as decomposed as he expected, given the conditions. There were many dead bodies around, and animals that fed on them were nearby, but my mother still hadn't been eaten. My father thought she had broken her spine or pelvis and therefore couldn't move." This information was unbearably heavy for Julianne. "My husband says, 'Don't think about it, you can't change it.' But it still bothers me a lot. I can't help but imagine what it must have been like to lie there motionless." Julianne compiled all these experiences and completed her book, which was published on March 10, 2011, under the title, When I Fell from the Sky. The book attracted great interest, was very well received, and won several awards. "During those lonely days in the forest, I said to myself, if I survive, I will do something very important for humanity and nature." Those were great words, but just words. Years later I thought, did I really achieve that? "This is another reason I feel guilty," says Julianne. In the years following the crash, Julianne made many trips and returned to Panguana repeatedly with her husband, Eric. So how did she cope with these long flights between Germany and Peru? "Long flights are difficult. I get so tense that even sleeping pills don't work. Red wine is always good. And whiskey," she replies with a slight smile. The Lockheed Electra that operated this flight was the last remaining aircraft of LANSA Airlines. A few weeks after this crash, the company lost its operating license. The factor thought to have caused the accident was a sudden updraft that formed during the storm. It was later understood that 14 passengers on the plane had survived the crash but lost their lives before help could reach them. Julianne Koep still works as a librarian at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology in Munich. Her autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky, was published by Piper Verlag in 2011 and won the Corine Literature Prize the same year. In 2019, she was honored by the Peruvian government with the Order of Merit for Distinguished Service, with the title of Grand Officer. Sometimes, falling from the sky is not about crashing to the ground, but about starting life from a different place. Julianne was reborn in the middle of the forest, and some survival stories are, beyond luck, a work of character. Nature sometimes kills, but sometimes it embraces you like a mother who knows you as well as you know yourself. Julianne's story shows how fragile life can be, and yet how strong. Because a person can draw strength from the root of a tree or from a mother's last glance, and some falls can turn into an ascent that lasts forever.